Marc Jacobs was the 1984 Parsons Student Designer of the Year, so in the run-up to his Spring-Summer 2024 show, the question arose as to whether he would revisit his earlier collections. There have been a lot of archival revivals in fashion in recent years that don't require special anniversaries. It's become all too common for designers of a certain age to quote themselves. Jacobs may be a student of fashion who often references the past, but he has never seemed particularly interested in his own history. He's too irreverent, and such self-criticism is simply out of fashion. Still, 40 years. That's a long time. There are only a handful of designers on the New York Fashion Week calendar, still a full week away from its official start, who can boast such longevity. Tom Ford, his fellow 90s superstar and just 2 years his senior, retired from the industry last year. But if Jacobs has become one of our elders, he has retained the madness of his youth. When the lights came up at the Park Avenue Armory, a huge folding table and chair stood at the back of the stage. They were the work of the late artist Robert Terrian, whom Jacobs quotes in his show notes. I try to stay with themes or objects or sources that I can trace back to my personal history. The further back I can trace something that's meaningful to me in some way, the more I'm drawn to it. The models emerged from backstage and walked under the table, a distorted perspective made all the more extreme by the exaggerated proportions of their clothes, the stiff, foam-like fabrics Jacobs chose, and the way some of the garments were sewn together with side seams on the outside, or exposed their alterations rather than hiding them. Their everydayness was almost squeezed out of them, a disorientation that felt timely and relevant. Chunky sweaters had their shoulders pushed forward to create strange 2D effects, and flat trompe-l'oeil embellishments were added to give the impression of a necklace or brooch. They were living paper dolls of a mid-century vintage, in ladylike suits, shifts, cocktail dresses, and evening columns glittering with oversized paillettes, though tracksuits with shrunken jackets and pants rising to the breastbone and pastel velour sets à la Juicy Couture via Balenciaga disrupted the swans on psychedelics narrative. So did the, ridiculously spacious version of his Venetia bag, an aughts bestseller that had a memorable cameo in The Devil Wears Prada. Walk the streets of New York or ride the subway, and you'll see Marc Jacobs tote bags everywhere, with the word tote bag written on the side in the familiar sans serif, large letters, a mini New Age phenomenon. Jacobs put his own thoughts to paper. Through the inevitable prism of time, my glass remains full of wonder and reflection, he wrote. 31 years after his infamous grunge collection for Perry Ellis, and 40 years after graduating, he remains New York's most trusted source for fashion updates. And not only that. So, Therian's sculpture was a perfect metaphor for the show's nostalgic grandeur built on the concept of the simple things that have sparked wonder, joy, imagination, and a sense of play in a designer's work. The models were essentially dolls, done up in exaggerated 60s glamour silhouettes with big windswept coiffes in retro hair dye colors by Duffy, and divas of yesteryear makeup by Diane Kendall. The clothes, shoes, and bags were fitted like paper doll clothes, meaning they stood off the body. Deliberately cartoonish, caught between the two-dimensional and three. At times the model's arms were frozen in a perfect doll pose. Meaningful themes to Marc Jacobs' canon strolled by at a pace conducive to taking it all in. The 60s secretaries, the trompe-l'oeil brooches, the sculpted jackets, chunky bright sweater and grey skirt pairings worn with more cartoon-like Mary Janes. There were plays on juicy couture velour tracksuits worn with sculpted panties from Jacobs's Heaven sub-brand, which made its runway debut at the Friday night show. Pastel tops and extreme culottes with undone combat boots gave a dose of grunge. But for the most part, the collection was about the kind of old-school dressing up that seems to mainly happen on screen these days, whether on your phone or in a Ryan Murphy joint. Swans was the word on every showgoer's lips as they filed out. The last impressions of the show, stark black ladylike bustier tops, sweetheart necklines, and golden mirrored gowns with enormous bell sleeves, lingering large. Marc Jacobs manages to be at once completely contemporary and of this moment while of another time. Amazing, rare, and disconcerting.